Booked and then come take my hand. We're rebels with a paperback plan.
Welcome to Season 2 of Booked and Banned, the podcast, where we discuss essential literature that has faced challenges and censorship. I'm your host, Naomi. Our book for this episode is The Yellow Birds by Kevin Powers. My guest is Peter, with whom I served in the United States Military Academy Department of English and Philosophy. Pete, welcome to the show. Please tell our listeners a little bit about who you are.
Yeah. Hello, Naomi. It's good to see you, and thanks for having me on Booked and Banned. It's been a little bit of time since we served together at West Point, but all the memories are still strong, and it's great to reconnect again. I was a 28-year Army veteran, served in the infantry, where I did things like go to Korea, go to Afghanistan, serve at Fort Bragg, but then a good part of it was teaching at West Point, where I taught in the Department of English and Philosophy. I became interested in war writing during that period, especially after my deployment to Afghanistan. And I started a blog called Time Now, The Wars in Iraq and Afghanistan in Art, Film, and Literature. And so I've written about books such as The Yellow Birds and the movies and all the art that's associated with war in Iraq and Afghanistan. I retired in 2015, and since then I've been teaching at Rutgers, where I'm currently coming to you from right now.
Awesome. Thank you so much. We are exploring Kevin Powers' 2012 novel, which functions as a profound meditation on trauma, the fragility of youth, and the gap between those who fight and those who wait at home. Powers, an Iraq veteran himself, uses a distinct rhythmic precision to follow 21-year-old Private John Bartle. The narrative shifts between Bartle's intense deployment in Tafar in 2004 and his subsequent return to a quiet life in Virginia, where he is forced to navigate the heavy psychological weight and moral complexity of a tragic secret. The same unvarnished refusal to sanitize the soldier's experience that gives the book its power has also caused it to be challenged or removed from specific shelves. Most objections originate from school districts where administrators or parents cite profanity and graphic violence, arguing the text is unsuitable for students. However, many educators maintain that censoring this intensity obscures the actual reality of military service, making the work an essential piece of contemporary literature. So, Pete, what was it about this specific narrative that led you to choose it for the podcast?
I was interested in The Yellow Birds for several reasons. One, it caught everyone's attention when it came out in 2012. And as I said, I was keeping a blog on war literature, and so tracking these things. And 2012 was a very important year in what we call post 9/11 writing or GWAT writing or war and mill writing. And The Yellow Birds by Kevin Powers, along with books by David Abrams, who I know you know, Fobbit, another book called Billy Lynn's Long Halftime Walk by a civilian author named Ben Fountain, all sort of marked the year as the coming of age of war writing about Iraq and Afghanistan. And of those books, The Yellow Birds was the most celebrated. And I would say rightfully so. I think it does a lot of things. It has a lot of aspects to it that made it remarkable in its time, and those things were noted. And I think it still retains its power now. So I wrote about it at the time, and then later I wrote about the movie. It's of a piece, I'll say this as well, in terms of your remarks about whether it should or should not be included on say, a high school curriculum. I'd say it certainly deserves a place there. One, it's very literary in nature, and so it's really good to teach. It's really good for students to explore not just depictions of battle and depictions of soldiering and whatnot, but sort of written in a heightened stylistic or literary register. So it's of a continuum, I would say, with books like The Red Badge of Courage, All Quiet on the Western Front, Catch-22, The Things They Carried. And so you can talk about The Yellow Birds, I think, in the same way you would talk about a lot of war writing and its rightness for study by young readers, just curious about war, but maybe we need to be a little bit mindful of their sensitivities and whatnot. I think they can handle it. I think it's a great book for teaching and part of that conversation about war writing in general, whether it's appropriate to be studied in high school. And I will again emphasize that I firmly believe it can be or it should be and deserves consideration along with those other texts that I've named.
I think most teenagers, they can handle more than perhaps their parents or administrators think they can handle. And so that's a big part of this discussion too,
Mhm.
especially with banned books. This book sharply illustrates the immediate lethal violence of engagement. It's a reality that looks different for everyone who deploys. As someone who has deployed to Iraq, I found certain echoes of the environment in these pages, though my experience was not as combat driven as the events in Al Tafar. My own experience occurred 5 or 6 years later than the characters, and it tended to be wild shifts between intensity and boredom. That was my experience of deployment. We had 3 combat casualties from a roadside bomb in my brigade. And at one point, 3 civilian contractor casualties from a mortar attack on our fob. We had many, many more people injured from athletic activities. And unfortunately, we also had more casualties from suicide. In the first few weeks of the deployment, when everything just sucks and everybody really misses their family and friends. And then also the first few weeks back from deployment, we had a rash of suicides. While the novel focuses on the immediate lethal violence of engagement, how does the story portray the psychological toll of that less visible reality, the mental strain that persists during the long stretches of waiting and the difficult transition back to civilian life?
That's a lot that you've unpacked there, and I could talk on many aspects of it. But the book excels at the psychological exploration of close proximity to death, exposure to carnage, death of ones you're close to, and the guilt and the obligation. That's definitely part of the soldier experience that can be extremely troubling. It came out at a time when sort of national conversations about these subjects was peaking, right? People were very worried about the plight of the individual soldier. They're curious about the way the battlefield or deployment looked in Iraq and Afghanistan. And they were curious about the young men and women that were fighting it. And they were curious about the struggles that many of them were having when they returned to the States. Powers joins that conversation and does a marvelous job at showing how it was sort of refracted through the eyes of a very sensitive young infantryman, right? And I think most people would agree that Bartle, the protagonist, is a very sensitive young man, and he takes the events that he participates in and witnesses very seriously, and they deeply trouble him. Whether that was Kevin Powers or not, I'm not exactly sure, but he certainly wrote a portrait of that experience of, like you said, even for an infantryman, the boredom of deployments and the boredom even of combat, even when you're out there in bad guy country, as the infantry guys like to call it, right? There's just moments and hours that just drag on, and they're informed by dread and apprehension, but they're also just trying to stay awake, and trying to entertain each other. And you see that very clearly at the beginning of the Yellowbirds, where Bartle and his buddy Murph are just idly passing time while they're out on a patrol. And then the war comes upon them very suddenly, and their interpreter is killed right in their presence, and the blood splatters over them. And all of a sudden, death, which seemed not exactly abstract, it was, Powers personifies it quite vividly in the opening scenes of the book, or at least war. But now it really is tangible. The precipitation of Bartle's psychological deterioration and Murphy's happens before they even deploy, but now it starts to accelerate. Uh, the book is set both in Iraq and then on Bartle's return to the States, specifically Virginia, post Army service. And so the scenes of extreme apprehension of death take place in Iraq, but there's an equal amount of times placed on life after deployment and the difficulty of adjusting and the difficulty of getting people to understand what you've been through, and war's long reach in the form of a criminal investigation of the events that took place, right? So the war doesn't quite leave them alone. towards the end, we see that very vividly. He's trying to escape it. He's trying to simmer down. He's trying to settle down. He's trying to put things in perspective. And yet the closing images indicate that it's never going to be completely over for him.
I think just looking at the suicide rates, and I'm only speaking from my brigade.
Yeah.
I don't know what they were for the Army as a whole. I didn't look them up. Maybe I should have done that. But we seem to have more suicides after deployment. Those first few weeks, you kind of understand it. It really just is awful. But when you come home, it's the people who either miss the adrenaline rush of these combat missions, or it's people who might have done something that they are not proud of that seems to drive that suicide rate when you return. And it almost seems to be a more dangerous time period, actually. One of the most striking literary choices in the novel is its title imagery, which traces its roots back to a military tradition. The yellow birds appear at several distinct points in the narrative, set up by the marching cadence, or what's called a Jody call, used as an epigraph to the novel. The yellow birds are a haunting, recurring presence, appearing as literal canaries at the observation posts to detect gas at the beginning of the novel. Later, we see a memory of Murphy's father bringing canaries home from the mine he worked in, only for the canaries to return to roost on their cages after being released. How does their presence evolve from a simple tactical detail into a symbol of the fragile boundary between life and death?
Yeah, I don't think it takes long for us to start thinking of the yellow birds in terms of a symbol. It's right there in the epigraph for the story where they quote the Jody call, but it got squashed, right? So it's about this the squelching of a yellow bird, and we all sing those. At least I did. We sang those as we were marching around in basic training, and you sort of understand that it's part of the hardening process of becoming a soldier. You don't take it all that seriously. Maybe you see some black humor, some gallows humor in it, or it passes at the time. But it's part of the process of acculturation into the military ethos, military culture, right? And then it's not hard to imagine that it speaks to the squelching, if not the killing, of innocence and beauty. And I think that's very much at work in the novel, right? Bartle and Murphy, his sidekick, are very young, very naive. There's a saying by the scholar Stacy Peebles about their narratives that the common story is that a young man or a woman thinks they're ready for what they're going to face, or they think the military will protect them, and yet it turns out not to be true, and then they have to live with the consequences, right? So the yellow birds is a foreshadowing, I think, of what's going to happen to Murph and Bartle and Sergeant Sterling and some of the other characters in the book too who don't make it out alive. But everyone's going to be changed by the experience in pretty dramatic ways. I don't know if you would agree, but I'd also smell a little reference to another famous book, To Kill a Mockingbird. And it's famous saying it's a sin to kill a mockingbird. Powers is a very literary minded guy. It's a very literary book. To Kill a Mockingbird is not about war, it's more about social justice, but still that young person grappling with evil and criminality and wrongness and having to live with it and having to figure out what to do with it is sort of an echo that ties those two books together.
Another echo, I think, is Bartle's name, because it puts me in mind of Bartleby the Scrivener, which is a short story by Herman Melville, which I know you are familiar with. Many in our audience may be familiar, even if they haven't read the story, with Bartleby the Scrivener, because Bartleby is this person that says, I prefer not to. And that's his form of resistance. But the people around him, or at least the unreliable narrator of the short story, they're completely cowed by this. But in the end, Bartleby dies and he kind of wills himself to death. And I found some echoes of that with Murphy in The Yellow Birds, as well as Bartle himself and his retreat into the wilds of Virginia, into this rural setting where he's living this quiet life. And then possibly when he's in prison, I'm always a little put off by the story Bartleby the Scrivener, because I think people interpret it incorrectly. The narrator thinks that Bartleby wills himself to death after his experience in this dead letter office trying to get all these letters to the right people and not succeeding. But Bartleby left that job and came to work for this lawyer doing deeds and contracts on Wall Street and in the financial district in New York City. And that's when he starts to will himself to death. Back to the whole suicide rate thing again. We think people will kill themselves at the beginning when we're all it just is awful and it sucks. But it's the people who kill themselves at the end of the deployment and after it's over that are really concerning. But that's an entire sidebar, and we don't need to go down there if you don't want to.
Well, I'd love to. The literary aspects may not be the central focus of what we have time to talk about today, but they're fascinating, right? Because I too sort of wonder at the connection between Bartle and Bartleby, and it's not exactly clear that it's a one-for-one sort of linkage there, in spite of the closeness of the name. Private Bartle, one of the things that happens to him is he has to evolve into a Bartleby-like character. The action of the story is precipitated on some pretty drastic acts, as if he could assume some agency that would allow him to affect things. His very promise to LaDonna Murphy it's sort of a pop-off answer. You don't know really why he does it, but it has huge reverberations. And then later on, he writes a crazy letter, the letter connection to Bartleby, right? Maybe the Purloin letter. There's all sorts of lettery things going on in the story, but the rationale for doing that is so mystifying. What was he thinking he was going to accomplish by writing that letter? And then at the end of the story, when he sort of acquiesces to Sergeant Sterling's decision to float Murphy's body down the river and not report that they found him, and that becomes not just a sin, but sort of a war crime, not just a moral evil, but an actual criminal act in military terms. So he's actually misguided in his actions, and then he learns the hard way that they all backfire or they all have unintended consequences, and the psychological import just mounts and mounts. So eventually, at the end of the novel, you see him maybe assuming a Bartleby-like pose that he didn't have earlier on. Maybe one more literary note, because we like to talk about these things. I really thought the end of the story, where it ends with this sort of dreamlike evocation of Murphy's body floating down the Tigris. I thought that was a great Gatsby sort of connection. If you remember Fitzgerald's stories about boats against the current or looking out over the water, I saw Powers trying to maybe recycle that motif or tip his hat to it in a very literary way. Perhaps I think too closely about these things. But on a serious note, the suicide issue that you've mentioned several times, okay, yeah, that's a huge concern in the book. We see suicide depicted in the form of Sergeant Sterling. We see Bartle contemplate it at length when he's back in Richmond, and he makes an effort to, and it's rescued. Murph is sort of suicidal himself. So the consequences of the misdeeds and the things that may have seemed trivial or maybe they seemed momentous at the time, they're very profound. The war experience just helps maybe accelerate or intensify the process, where young men and women without the capacity to deal with things see death as a solution, right? Death as a way out, or death as inevitability. And so it spoke to those national concerns about suicide rates among veterans. I think there's a widely bandied statistic, like 21 veterans a day are committing suicide. And those sorts of ideas were in the news all the time, right? Back in 2012, 2014, 2015, et cetera.
I think you're right about a lot of the literary allusions to find in this book, which makes it so rich. There's a thematic transition between combat and home that's reinforced by the book's specific prose style. Powers uses a rhythmic prose that feels almost like poetry, despite the grim nature of the subject matter, though I find it more meditative perhaps than lyrical. How does this shift in style between the sensory chaos of the battlefield and the quiet life Bartle returns to in Virginia.
There's a lot going on stylistically in the book. Powers has been criticized for that. Some readers, to include veterans and civilians alike, expect something a little bit different out of war writing, maybe sort of a more gut bucket, realistic focus on events, and maybe a sort of hesitancy about reaching for heightened literary effects or big meta themes like memory and writing and remembrance and shame and guilt, right? But Powers, we should remember, started out as a poet upon his return from combat when he first set his sights on becoming a writer. In one interview I read, he was influenced by Brian Turner, whose work I think we both know. He published a poem in American Poetry magazine, I think in 2009, in which Bartle makes the first appearance. I guess sometime during graduate school that he awakened to the possibilities that he had a story to tell, and yet a lot of the poetry lingers in the prose. So, for example, if I can read just a short one, I won't slow things down too much for a long excerpt, but you see it right away in the opening lines. The war tried to kill us in the spring. We moved over them and through the tall grass on faith, needing paths into the windswept growth like pioneers. While we slept, the war rubbed its 1,000 ribs against the ground in prayer. You could separate the lines of that paragraph into a stanza and it would read like poetry, and you can see his imagery and his personification of war sort of announcing itself as a different breed of war story. He's been criticized for that. There's a line later on. I think he hits the right notes. I like the prose style. I'm a big fan of it. I think he does not go wrong, does not make many errors. But there's one line later in the story where he writes, "Clouds spread out over the Atlantic like soiled linens on an unmade bed." And if you go to Reddit, right, there's a whole Reddit thread on that line, and people are going like, what the heck is that? Is this a sign of good writing or is this a sign of bad writing? Can it be over rich or can it get too purple prosy in certain places? Is he trying too hard or whatnot? But I like it. I like what he does. To get more, to hone in more on your question, some of the scenes in combat, well, they hit a lot of different notes all over the place. So some of them are sort of stock scenes. Like there's a scene where they're visited by a reporter. The reporter's trying to suss out what it's like to be a soldier and what's combat like. And this comes up a lot in war fiction, this divide between the experience and what the soldiers know and what those who nominally are sent to find out about it can understand. And so this hesitancy, Bartle doesn't want to talk, but Murph does. And Murph explains that it's like a slow moving car wreck. Being in combat's like a slow moving car wreck. It seems to be happening, but it's out of your control. Time seems to slow down. But I've seen that phrase recycled a few times. I'm not sure if Powers hit on it first, and he's put it in the mouth in the mouth of Murphy, right? Bartle's descriptions of combat are sort of different. Now, when he comes back, it's interesting to characterize the overall tone of the book. You didn't like the word lyrical, maybe a little bit elegiac, a little bit contemplative. I don't know exactly how you would say it, right? He certainly seems a little, you could say sour and dour. I don't know. There's a lot of ways you could talk about it. Meditative might be the one I would use most. Now, when he's back in the States in that first summer after he redeploys, he's alienated, he's alone, he's psychologically troubled. He's not talking to his mother. He sort of knows CID is going to be coming after him eventually, right? So he can't get his life going. Why get a job? I go to college? They're going to come after me. He's drinking way too much. And these are all sort of familiar things we know of troubled vets, the kind of things they do. And yet he goes for a walk along the James River and he's contemplating suicide. And really one of the most tour de force passages in the book occurs about that time. I certainly can't read all of it because it's a sentence that's 500 words long, for crying out loud. So what are you going to do with that? It's on page 144 for those of you reading along. He goes, "Or should I have said I wanted to die, not in the sense of wanting to throw myself off that train bridge over there, but more like wanting to be asleep forever because there isn't any making up for killing women or even watching women get killed, or for that matter, killing men and shooting them in the back and shooting them more times than necessary to actually kill them." So it's sort of a confession of the horrible things that he did and how they weigh on him. And it goes on for over 2 pages. So that's a tour de force. That's a bravura sentence. But of course, it's also a lot. And it's very graphic. A teacher presenting that to 11th graders might have to provide a little context or a trigger warning to let them know what's coming. So in terms of the style, I would say that Powers has got a lot going on. He's got a lot of gears. He's not just describing the proximity to death, not just describing the sense of guilt for not saving Murphy, but he's endlessly riffing on the nature of remembrance and the power of writing to either convey the truth or hide the truth or shape the truth. Those are some heavy hitting themes that he's always trying to find inventive prose styles to narrate or articulate.
That sentence that you only read part of, it's very Faulknerian in length, right?
Right, yeah.
Faulkner would have these long, involved sentences that kind of circled back on themselves, but they were fantastic.
Well, it's a way to show
Um,
the overwhelmingness of experience, right? It's like everything inside the brain is just bubbling over, and you got to find a prose style. But Faulkner's, he's the one everyone would point to for writing sentences of that sort. And I see that comes up in war writing a lot when you reach that moment of peak intensity to express the most powerful expressions. The periods and the commas start to slip away.
Yeah. At the core of the deployment narrative is the profound bond between Bartle and the younger Private Daniel Murphy,
Mhm.
which is complicated by an external obligation. The promise Bartle makes to Murphy's mother acts as a heavy anchor for his conscience throughout the story. Decades of research, starting with studies of World War II veterans, suggests that the bonds between soldiers often become more powerful than any other connection, including those to family or abstract ideals. Given this psychological reality, where a soldier's focus is narrowed almost exclusively to the survival of the peer standing beside them, how does Bartle's promise to a civilian mother complicate his loyalty to Murphy? In what ways does the novel explore the tension between these external domestic commitments and the singular bond formed in a combat zone?
That's a great question. It's really at the core of the novel's plot and its thematic concerns. I went back and reread that scene where LaDonna Murphy asked Bartle to promise to take care of Murphy. It's interesting how Bartle in the moment doesn't realize the momentousness of it. It seems like a weird thing to be laid on him by the mother of one of his comrades. And his answer is a little bit of a pop off answer. And he says, yeah, sure, I promise. And yet it's Sergeant Sterling who overhears it and just says, man, you just stepped in it. That was the worst thing you can do. And he takes Bartle outside and he punches him and he berates him and says, you're getting into a situation in which you're way over your head and promises mean something. And if you can't keep a promise, it's going to hurt you. It's going to feel bad. It's going to feel real bad. It's going to complicate what's already a very complicated thing already. And so that's a wake up call for sure for Bartle. Now, the story speaks to that sort of camaraderie and fellowship that soldiers have. And you read that all the time, that soldiers fight for one another, right? And you form very intense bonds with each other. You don't care about larger political aims or even military strategy. You care about keeping each other alive. And so I think Powers is riffing on that. He's found a story to amplify that concern or exemplify that concern, where a literal promise has been made, where the unspoken is spoken, and it's spoken to somebody outside the circle and outside the tribe. And Sergeant Sterling is very attuned to what appropriate military behavior norms should be. Sterling's got his own issues with obligation and responsibilities. Sergeants loom very large in the lives of young soldiers, and we see exactly what motivates them. It's his job to keep them alive, and he takes it very seriously. He gets torn up when Murphy and Bartle start to deteriorate. Then when Murphy really descends into sort of madness or irrational behavior, that works on him big time too. Powers is very astute in sort of exploring those psychological dimensions and suggesting that what makes military service very fulfilling for many of us is the bonds. We feel very good about the people we serve with, and we're kind of fond with them. And the shared experience brings us together. Military culture, I think we all have our issues with that in one way or another, but it's not always toxic. Powers brings out the way these things can become very toxic and very poisonous and drive people to overemphasize them, or they become twisted in ways that are destructive, not beneficial, don't save us, don't make us better, but cause us to come ever closer to all kinds of criminality and bad things and bad thoughts and bad results. One more aspect to it is the return to the States. And one more way that the Yellowbirds plugs into national conversations was examining the plight of the returned veteran and being respectful of their service and thanking them for their service and being mindful of their stories. And yet it seems pretty common that lots of veterans quickly learn that not many people want to hear their stories. It's a difficult process of telling stories. The worst thing that happened to me in Afghanistan, in the aftermath, we were descended upon by chaplains and counselors and things like that. And one of the things the chaplain said always stuck with me is what happened today, you're going to spend the rest of your life thinking about, and you're going to be looking for someone to tell it to, but you may not find that person. You're always going to be testing everybody to see if they're the appropriate recipient of this story that's important to you, but you got to think very carefully about how to lay it on somebody else. And so that gets dramatized all throughout the end of the book, particularly through Bartle's sort of strange relationship with LaDonna Murphy. There's a connection there. The connection's even more heightened in the movie where Jennifer Aniston plays the Mrs. Murphy character, there seems to be something going on. Let's just say Bartle writes that letter, that weird letter, and then they meet in the prison afterwards, and it's almost anticlimactic. Like Donna Murphy is actually not accusatory. She's not really forgiving either, but she just wants to have that meeting, and that represents a sort of closure. But it's not really the end of the story as far as Bartle is concerned. What's happening there, I think, is just that difficulty of finding someone to explain yourself to. And the book at large sort of represents that too. How do you find words, and what is the use of words to understand a war experience and the trauma that goes with it?
When I was in the service, I was hyper visible as a woman
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
in a uniform. And then once I was a veteran, I am completely invisible because no one expects a 5'2" woman who looks feminine to have served 25 years in the military. Nobody expects that. So I'm completely invisible, and it's very odd. It was almost kind of a whiplash to experience. But I don't want to take up all of our time with some of my war stories, as it
Super
were.
interesting. It's like your secret power, honestly, right? It's like I know things that you don't know about me, right? Like
Yeah,
that.
for sure.
At the end of his story, he wants to be normal again. He wants no one to know who he is and no one to know what he does. I mean, that's sort of a privilege, sort of let's just say a white male privilege, right? He can reach that point where he doesn't think it's important that he has something to say. He would prefer, he said Bartleby word, right? Not to be reminded. Other people maybe have something to say that people need to hear.
These intense combat bonds and moral decisions have sparked significant pushback. For instance, in 2014, when the novel was selected for Philadelphia's citywide reading program, it faced immense debate regarding its maturity and quote unquote obscenity. It has faced documented parent challenges in New York school curricula, alongside recurring online backlash from military supporters who argue it depicts the conflict in an unpatriotic light. This book has faced various challenges due to its raw language and depictions of violence, or rather the aftermath of violence, with some critics arguing that the choices made by characters in the field are tactically or legally unrealistic. These factors often lead to its removal from curricula or libraries under the guise of being an unrepresentative portrayal of service. When we look at the specific difficulties of teaching contemporary war narratives, how do these attempts at censorship reflect either a fundamental misunderstanding of the soldier's reality or a broader societal struggle to control the actual unvarnished costs of war, especially modern conflict?
Yeah, it's a great question. It speaks to a lot of the conversations or hullabaloo around the Yellowbirds upon it. So first thing I'd say is a lot of veterans don't like the book for those reasons. This isn't a real infantryman, or these aren't things that could really happen, or why this book and why this story? Why are you paying attention to this story? Those are the sort of things that you often hear in veteran circles that criticize the book. In terms of the general public, especially its its place in school curricula or organized reading programs. If you're going to make those arguments about the yellow birds, you can make them about the red badge of courage and all quiet on the Western Front, Catch 22, and the things they carry, many of which are far more graphic and far more pointed, maybe not far more pointed, but very pointed in their critique of military efficiency or military aims, military ideals, and all the rest. In that way, it slots into conversations about the appropriateness of war writing in general and what do you get when you study it. Typically, war literature, as opposed to military thriller or action memoirs or whatever, it sort of attempts to portray the human cost of war. The Yellowbirds, I think, does that admirably. And what else would you want a book about war to be doing? Celebrating war or celebrating patriotism in some sort of naive, superficial, really obvious, clunky way? The book is meant to take you to a sort of a complex vantage point. Now, in terms of its current and its time and place, the book doesn't really mention national war aims or hate or criticize the government or really criticize the military on large in very pointed ways. But in a time of war, I guess a critic would say that this is not what people need to be thinking about. In terms of its focus on death and carnage and the dark side of life, perhaps that's not of the fashion, at least in school now, right? I talk to my students and ask them what they read. And I will say that most of them have read the things they carry. That is a fixture in high school curricula, but they haven't read much else. And much of the reading is focused on, well, really, it's young adult fiction these days as part of the school curriculum. And then there's a lot of identity-based literature and things that are more directly relevant to like the experience of young people today, whereas the war is very foreign and very strange and not comfortable, or at least educators think it is that way. Again, I would think that's all unfortunate. I don't want to disparage any kind of reading or literature or efforts to teach it or expose young people to writing, but there's certainly a place for complex, brooding works such as The Yellow Birds and war writing in general.
This was the first time I had read The Yellow Birds. I
Mhm.
was not familiar with it before you picked it.
Oh,
And I actually loved it. And I thought in some ways it was very realistic in its depiction of a soldier's experience. And we all experienced our own war in our own way. You were in Afghanistan, I was in Iraq, I was there at a different time period when things might have been a little bit calmer. Mine was calmer. We were an advise and assist brigade, so it
yeah.
was supposed to be calmer because we were helping the Iraqis conduct
And
their first democratic elections.
mhm.
And when Kevin Powers was there himself, it was not as calm. There was a lot more combat, and we all experience it in different ways. But I don't think that that takes away from the realism. At least for me, I found it very realistic.
Powers was there very early, and infantry were thrown into all kinds of situations. As the war developed, they actually tried to limit the exposure of even infantry troops to ground combat and farm that out to the special forces with good, bad, or ugly consequences of that move. But Powers is right on in terms of the fear that we all faced with missile and mortar barrages that could come out of the blue and snuff out a life, even if someone who never goes outside the compound, outside the fob. That's a climactic moment in the story. He also is alert, and maybe not in the most significant way, but there is the presence of women on deployment in the form of the young medic who gets hit by one of the mortar shells and precipitates Murphy's downfall. These are real things. These are ways the story does depict the reality of the deployment experience that a lot of soldiers can relate to.
As we conclude this look into such a profound meditation on trauma and memory, what is the core perspective or message that you want to leave with our listeners?
I'd say read the Yellow Birds and be alert to what it's trying to say. I think what it is trying to say complex, but maybe most bluntly, it's trying to say that war brings you very close to death. You will live in proximity to death. You will live in proximity to carnage. You may be asked to kill, and people close to you may get killed. No light thing. That's no light matter, and we shouldn't pass it off as such. It also asks us to think that the psychological strain is no trifling matter. To not be happy with your military or combat or deployment experience is a very debilitating, disabling feeling that's going to leave you feeling rotten for a good long time. And that's what happens to Bartle, seems to have failed miserably, and he berates himself and he hates himself and he can't live with himself. Um, words of forgiveness just sound hollow, and he wouldn't believe them even if they were given to him. He's got to find his own way towards peace. The long term psychological difficulties of living with the things that you do when you're sent to war is very well expressed in the Yellowbirds.
Nicely said. Thank you so much for having this conversation with me today. We had a lot of great things to talk about, and we went off on some tangents that maybe we didn't expect, but were fantastic anyway. Our next episode will be a discussion of The Catcher in the Rye by J.D. Salinger. Thank you for joining us. As Isaac Asimov said, any book worth banning is a book worth reading.
Booked and banned and bound by pages, stories hiding through the ages, whispered truths that still ring clear for those who choose to listen here.